It's a great pleasure to be with someone who is such a has such profound knowledge about desire. Uh, I can't claim to have specialized in this subject, but among my many books, there's one on Kama Sutra, and there's one also on Krishna. And the book on Krishna has 5 chapters: child, lover, warrior, savior, God. Usually, all my friends only read the lover chapter, and they say that they've enjoyed the book greatly and have been rid of all guilt forever. But essentially, the point I wanted to make is that at least in the Hindu worldview, there has always been a very enlightened acceptance of desire and the sensual. In the Hindu worldview, as I was saying earlier in my session on Adi Shankaracharya, there are 4 purusharths or goals of a balanced life: dharma, artha, kama, moksha. And typically, like all our texts, when Vatsyayan writes the Kama Sutra, it's a book I would recommend you to read. It's not only about impossible postures, it's a book which represents a philosophy. And in the first chapter, Vatsyayan is asked by an imaginary interlocutor, why do we need this book? And Vatsyayan's answer is that dharma, arth, Kama, and moksha are the 4 goals of life. And if the first 3, dharma, arth, and Kam, are pursued in proportion and not in exclusion, then as part of a balanced life, you automatically move towards moksha or salvation. In other words, by the sheer statement that is made, the pursuit of the sensual has philosophical validity. It does not mean you pursue it in exclusion, but it has philosophical validity. And it is for this reason that you will find that in our tradition, in our epics, in the life of Krishna himself, who is called Shringar Murtimam, the very epitome of the sensual mood, and his counterpart, who was an invention of Jayadev. There is no mention of Radha until the 12th century AD or CE. There is no Radha. He does the Ras with a group of gopis. Radha comes in the 12th century AD because there was a need to find to someone who is the Shringar Murtimam a perfect foil. And she is called Raseshwari, the very pinnacle of the sensual mood in her own right. And so you have Krishna and Radha. So there is this enlightened view. And what I was discussing with Madhavi, and I'd like her to speak because she's written so much on this subject, is why today there is such a gulf between, on the one hand, the philosophical acceptance of the sensual. Because Vatsyayan's answer is, if it has philosophical validity, it's not enough just to be a lover. You must be a good lover. And therefore the book. So why on the one hand we have this kind of history and this kind of acceptance, and on the other so much hypocrisy in our society. And today a band of illiterate evangelicals who go about policing young couples on streets and parks to preserve Indian culture without any knowledge of what that culture really was. Actually, the critique of the sensual in Indian culture was a colonial construct. It was the British who said that our tradition is full of unmentionable things and carnality and sensuality and the pursuit of the physical. There was this relentless critique. And that seems to have been internalized by a group of evangelicals whose evangelism is in direct correspondence to their illiteracy. So, this is the great syndrome. And I'd like, should I call you Professor Madhavi?
Too
Or
late, you already
Madhavi?
called me Madhavi. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I've
So
already
now
called you.
I'll know you're being a bad student.
So,
Yeah.
so Madhavi will take this further.
Well, I mean, I want to get to that question, but I want to take up a couple of other things earlier based on what you said. One is when I started writing my book on a history of desire in India, I did not actually want to go to the Kama Sutra. Because I said, oh, that's so cliched, it's so typical. Anyone thinking about desire in India will go to the Kama Sutra, and I didn't want to do that. But I was teaching it in any case, so I was reading it. And when I read it, and it is amazing how few people have actually read the Kama Sutra. In fact, almost nobody has. But when I was reading it, it is an astonishing text, astonishingly non judgmental, but even more than that, astonishingly expansive in the possibilities that it allows us both sexually and socially. So, for instance, you were talking about that opening chapter where he says, why write this book at all? He has a sub question in the opening chapter of the Kama Sutra where he says, and unlike what most people think, the Kama Sutra actually can often read like a very dry scientific treatise because he keeps saying, this scholar said this scholar said that, and then that scholar said this, and here's what Vatsyayana says. So he says, a sub question in his first chapter is, scholars say that the Kama Sutra should not be taught to women and should not be learnt by women. So and so says it this way, so and so says it that way. But, he says, Vatsyayana says that women have to learn these arts. And that was an astonishing statement to make in the 3rd century CE. And it's an argument, of course, that very few people actually make now, when the argument is, of course, to keep women out of everything or as much as possible. And so the Kama Sutra to me is a really politically explosive text that I think more of us should take the time to just sit down and read. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing I want to say, and that's also about the title of our session, which is Love and Longing in Hindustan. And I was very interested in us having that word Hindustan there because, of course, we speak so much about Hindu traditions of desire and about Hindu traditions of sexuality. But, of course, there is hardly any concept, of a Hindu tradition in India today that is not also complexly interwoven with traditions from other religions and countries as well. So in fact, even our access to multiple texts of Hindu traditions are all through translations sanctioned under the Mughal emperors, for instance. That's just a small example of that. And so I really want us to be aware of the interwoven threads of our desire, not only because a lot of our access to Hindu texts comes via Muslim translations, but also because the landscape of our desire in India is very much populated, and you would know this, Pavan, because you've written that book on Ghalib, for instance, is very much populated by an Indian, and when I say Indian, I mean subcontinental, Islamic mentality that is very, very open and free and sensuous, for instance, about male-male desire and male-male erotics. And that is our heritage. We are all inheritors of multiple traditions that, compared to the moment we are in today, are incredibly expansive, incredibly permissive, and incredibly non-judgmental. There is not a single line in Mir or in Vatsyayana that says, if someone is canoodling on a bench in the park, send the anti-Romeo squad, right? There is nothing of the kind that says, in fact, for Vatsyayana, if you're feeling desire for someone, you should show it in the park. For him, parks are actually very important. And so there is the sense of how have we got here today when we have had centuries of syncretic, complex, interwoven desires. Pavan's response to that, of course, is that sort of, illiterate evangelists, which I like very much. But I actually think it's more than that. And what worries me, it's not just the illiterate evangelists. If we could say, oh, it's the illiterate evangelists, then we can almost cocoon ourselves away from them. My fear is that we are all becoming more desirous of having simple answers in life. And so we're really giving up on a sense of complexity that our histories of desire give to us. And so I feel we are all complicit with the so-called illiterate evangelists, because we all want there to be a yes or a no, or a black or a white. Whereas when we are straying into the waters of desire, it's actually things are not so cut and dried. Things are not so hard and fast. And can we deal with that complexity, I think, is the question for all of us today, actually, in terms of desire. What do you think, Pavan?
No, I like your phrase, straying into the, what did you say, of
Into the
desire?
waters of desire. Yeah.
Straying into the waters of desire. So if you have strayed into them, you might as well swim with it. The the essential thing that I want to say is that this is not about men and women reacting differently. I have yet to read a text written so far ago in posterity which is so sensitive to the needs of a woman beyond the morality question
Yeah.
than the Kama Sutra. Because the Kama Sutra, and that incidentally is only one text that has survived, and there are for the 1,000 years before that umpteen number of texts on the same theme. Otherwise, if there was not this acceptance, you cannot have in the park temples like Khajuraho and Konarak. But even there is a certain structure to it, and Madhavi can correct me. On the lowest base of Khajuraho, you will have explicitly erotic sculpture. Many of you have been to Khajuraho. In the middle part of the temple, you will have the god Vishnu, Shiva, Mahadev, Brahm. I don't know if Brahma is there, but Vishnu and Shiva certainly are. With their consort. All our gods have consorts. And the Shakt tradition gives far more power to the female principle as the active power underlying the power that lies with the actual god. The goddess is in fact the power latent within that divinity. But that is also a part. Why I was saying, Madhavi, about men and women being part of this story is that in the Kama Sutra, so much care is given on the creation of the right mood for the expression of sensuality. But San goes to great lengths, starting with personal hygiene, then the appropriate place, the creation of the right mood through music, incense, the view, the art of repartee, conversation. It is not, what is that expression in America, wham, bam, something, thank you, ma'am. No, it's not. It's not. Because it talks about the acceptance of desire, the accomplishment of being able to implement the acceptance of desire, and doing so while being exceptionally sensitive to the needs of a woman which may be similar to that of a man but different in terms of their triggers. And that understanding at that time, I think, is significant.
Yeah.
Is significant because how you actually take that tryst, and that tryst is beyond categories of morality. How do you take that tryst, the love tryst, from the meeting to the conversation to a drink to, you know, the I think it was Freud who used the expression, the delicious postponement of fulfillment. How do you actually choreograph that delicious postponement of fulfillment? It could be a different script for women, it could be a different script for a man. Mostly men are far less sensitive in these matters. So there was not only the acceptance, there was also a manual how to treat women in terms of their desires.
Yeah. I mean, a couple of things. What fascinates me, not just about the Kama Sutra, but a lot of literature, painting, sculpture, architecture, is that about the interchangeability of the male and female principles, which is to say, masculinity and femininity don't necessarily reside in separate bodies. Exactly. And so when you have statues of Shiva and Parvati, you also have statues of Ardhanarishwara. You also have statues of Harihara, which is Vishnu and Shiva together. And so the idea that right now that we inhabit of this rigid gender distinction simply didn't exist and was certainly not seen as being existent in any kind of rigid, stereotypical way. I mean, I like to joke that the sculptures in Khajuraho seems explicitly designed to break every law in the land today, right? There's not a single sculpture there that you'll see that describes legal sex as we understand the law today.
Even after the judgment of 377.
I was just going to say, the 377 changed that a little bit, but only a little. And what's fascinating to me, of course, to go back to something that Pavan said about colonial rule in India, when I was writing my book, I kept joking that I really did not want to blame the British for everything, but I failed in doing that. Because with every chapter that I wrote, I came upon a British law that suddenly put an end to everything, right? So whether it was hijras, men dressing as women, they called the hijras a criminal tribe. That act is 1871 still. It was a Criminal Tribes Act. Whether it was Krishna and 16,000 gopis, Krishna and Radha cross-dressing, whether it was Nizamuddin and Khusro singing to Nizamuddin as his lover, Bulle Shah, anything or anybody, the colonial powers really put an end to that. And so what's fascinating to me, if we think about this from the legal perspective, is that when the British were coming up with laws with which to govern India, they had to pick what ancient texts they would base these laws on. So they picked, Code Napoleon, the Louisiana Code, all those things as well. But the Indian texts, they were completely flummoxed because there were, as always with everything in India, millions of available possibilities, right? I mean, in Hinduism itself, as you know, there are 330 million gods. So they didn't quite know what to pick. And because they were the colonizers, because they were the colonial masters, they made the most conservative choices of both Islamic and Hindu texts. And I think we're still bearing the brunt of that. So with Hinduism, they picked the Manusmriti as the basis according to which Indian or Hindu law would be codified. And with Islam, they picked the Quran rather than the Hadith, for instance, on which to base their law, ignoring thousands of traditions of lived realities across India, which differed from region to region and language to language. And so it's been a 250-year project to try and codify Indian attitudes to desire, such that we are told that you can either be this or you can be that. And this is coming on the heels of centuries of mingled syncretic traditions in which you really didn't need to make a choice between this and that, or rather, if you made a choice between this and that today, it was understood that you could well change your mind tomorrow. Whereas today, when you pick, you're meant to pick and just stay in that category. And I think for us, it's a real loss, and it's very much tied with the way we are governed legally as well, and the choices that the Brits made in that front.
Actually, it's very important to be in touch with your own mythology and traditions. And I'll give you two examples. One of the more famous ones is when Shiva is deep in meditation. And if you have read the Ramayana, Tulsidasa's Ramcharitmanas, I want to refer to this, that the gods were worried that he will never be woken up or made awake again from his meditation. Yeah. And all the demons needed Shiva to be once again alive and kicking. And so the gods decide to send Kama to awaken and distract Shiva. And if you read the description in Tulsidasa's Ramcharitmanas of the journey of Kam as he moves towards Shiva, it's a remarkably beautiful literary text. where as Kama moves, everything on this empirical plane is attracted towards him. The trees bend towards him, the birds come to him, the flowers bend towards him, the breeze is influenced by him. That is the power of attraction of Kam. And then the significant part of the story is that when Kam shoots that arrow, which hits Shiva and breaks his meditation, it's very simple in terms of mythology to Cupid and the arrow. Shiva's third eye opens in anger, and Kama is burned to ashes. But now that Shiva is awake and Parvati is there, he asks Parvati, ask for a boon, and it shall be granted to you. And Parvati says, what is left now to ask, now that you have destroyed Kama? It is Parvati who says this. To which Shiva says, but I have destroyed him now. She said, no, revive him. And then Shiva revives Kam, but without a body. So in a sense, Kam is invisible.
So Pavan, can I just add to that? I think it's a very, very important point that Kama in Indian mythology is what is called Ananga. He's not with a body. And so when we think about desire, we often make the mistake of thinking about bodily genital desire. But actually, for centuries, our understanding of desire has been as something that exists everywhere, not localized in a body, not located in a specific body. Desire is that thing which resides in everything and everyone and everywhere. And that is really an expansive understanding of desire.
And I think exactly as she said, there's another very telling example which I actually quote in my book on Krishna. In the 16th century, if I'm not mistaken, there was a high-level Vaishnav congregation of the high priests of the Vaishnav religion to decide once and for all whether Radha is Krishna's wife or mistress. And when they emerge after days of confabulation, they come out and they say that no, she is his mistress. But more interesting than that announcement was the reason they give for it. And they say that if the physical, the sensual, or the sexual can also be a window to the divine, then the intensity of desire that exists in forbidden love far outstrips the predictable pleasures of a stable relationship like marriage. Now, this is an explanation given by the Vaishnav saints who are deciding on a principal deity's consort or whether she is wife or mistress.
And I just want to say, and we had a law against adultery
and
until very recently.
So that's the colonial critique. And she talked about the translation. You know, Ghalib, as you mentioned, I'll just say that there's one nazam of Ghalib. And in those days, to use the word Havas means lust. And one of his very famous nazams begins with मुद्दत हुई है यार को मेहमा किए हुए जोशे कदर से बज़्म चिरागां किए हुए. And in that there is a line, मांगे है फिर किसी को लबे बाम पर हवस, not इश्क, not प्यार, हवस, lust. मांगे है फिर किसी को लबे बाम पर हवस, जुल्फे सियाह रुख पे परेशान किए हुए. With her tresses all परेशान.
Or his.
Or
because
his.
The pronoun, as you know, the pronoun with Persian poetry was always male.
But for me, it's her.
Okay. That speaks to your sensibilities. But Pavan, we've got to open it to the audience for some questions at least. So we have a few minutes.
Yeah, very little time for questions. But let me help you moderate this. We've got a question, a very eager hand up at the back there.
Eager is good.
Good evening, both of you. First of all, it was a very informative talk, and I have a general question for both of you. And the recurring themes in this session was how masculinity and femininity is not. It doesn't require the gender aspect attached to it. And if you're familiar with it, Neil Gaiman, he's a British American author. He has a series called The Sandman. Sandman. It's a graphic novel series. So one of the prominent characters there is desire. Desire is, it's not a personification, it's desire itself.
Yeah.
And multiple times it's shown that the desire doesn't have a gender. And as another one of ma'am's books, the Shakespeare, Shakespeare is actually a very prominent character in this series as well. And one of the volumes is called Midsummer Night's Dream.
Yeah.
So question one, was this an inspiration for your work? And the second question is, what's the role of fiction such as this
Yeah.
in gender sensitization in the Indian context?
Yeah. I mean, I love that question because it presumes that my interest in Shakespeare kindled my interest in Indian traditions. And you're absolutely right. Because I'm not actually a scholar of India, I'm a scholar of desire. And because my work has been on Shakespeare for so many years, it was wonderful for me to be able to find these landing points, multiple landing points across different syncretic traditions in India. Absolutely. And you know what I was just saying about Persian poetry, where the gender of the beloved is always masculine because Persian is not a gendered language, so it gets done as he. But often the beloved is named as a man. So when Khusro writes for Nizamuddin, he names Nizamuddin. Or Bulle Shah writes for Shah Inayat, he names him. And so, and of course, you know, with Shakespeare's plays and poetry, as many of you know, there is always that sort of friction between women with each other or men with each other. And so, absolutely, I think if there's a world of desire, both Vatsyayana and Mir and Khusro and Shakespeare would all live there together with Mirabai, for instance, talking about 16th century Vaishnavites, in a world that sadly we do not occupy right now.
One last question. We have a lady right in front here. Yes. It's okay. It's
small question only. I was expecting this love and longing in the times of love and longing in Hindustan. Actually, I was expecting love and longing in the times of Me Too, because so much is going on.
Yeah.
So you talked about those evangelists, that they are putting some kind of break. So what about Me Too? Will it put some kind of break in?
Yeah, please.
I think that when we talk of desire, to even remotely interpret it as the tolerance of men's ability to force themselves on women is highly condemnable.
wow. Absolutely right, sir.
You have to be, quite apart from deeply short of pedigree, you have to be fairly retarded to proceed on that line.
So just in a brief answer, I hope it puts the brakes in the right places where they need to be put, and allow conversations like these to happen more and more.
Lovely. We have one last question from ma'am.
Since we're talking about love and longing in Hindustan, I just wanted to know, what is your approach to solving this terrible problem we have of complete lack of imagination in approaching desire, and what is natural in life? I mean,
I have one solution. I have a book called Kama Sutra. It has sold rather well, but it's my least read books. Because all my authors, and many of them are largely Indian, only see the illustrations. They never read the text.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think that's a terrific question. And I just want to sort of approach it slightly obliquely. The 377 judgment, for instance, that was just delivered, and which is a fabulous judgment in both tone and content and spirit. But what was interesting to me about it as well is that all 400 pages of the judgment, all concurring judges, not a single dissenting judgment, all of them refer variously to Oscar Wilde, to Shakespeare, to Roe v. Wade, to Bowers v. Hardwick in the US, to various cases in the UK and the US, and there is not a single reference to any kind of traditions of India. Not one. And
This
so
is
that to me,
unforgivable, your lordships.
and that to me betrays a lack of imagination. Because if we really want
Lack
to,
of knowledge.
and if we think that these kinds of, if we think that repressive structure that actually has destroyed so much in us as well, in the subcontinent, is our road to salvation, then that is sad indeed. And I don't think we should be indulging in nativism. I think right now we are far behind any of these other countries. But I think we do need to remind ourselves that when we use the word we, who are we talking about? When we use the word us, who are we talking about? When we use the word our cultural traditions or our cultural history, what cultures are we talking about? No one asks those questions these days. And we need to begin by saying, we want to ask questions. We don't need answers right away. We need to have the conversations rather than rushing to solutions.